Welcome to the People Strategy Forum podcast. We're a show that guides leaders on how to elevate the overall workplace. We believe that people are the heart of successful organizations and team members' well-being, rewards, development, and it's all essential to a happy and healthy workforce. So this show discusses the practical and effective leadership strategies of top executives, senior professionals, and talent managers overall. So I would like to introduce you to our core team today on this mastermind. And we have Shar Miller. Shar is a serial entrepreneur, has many businesses, and also is an accomplished HR professional, as she's been a chief people officer at many locations. Also, we have with us today is Howard Niswitz. He is also a HR professional and specializing in compensation and systems. Has worked in many of the large organizations, and Howard and I have worked together for quite some time, and even early in our career. So happy to have him on the show today. And then also Sumit Singla. Sumit is a broadcasting out of India. He's an established HR professional, and he helps organizations with their culture, and he's known as the culture guy. And Sumit and I have written a book together on the workforce experience, and so very pleased to have him here and his global expertise. But today, as our topic is ask for what you want in leadership. So it promises to shift your approach to pursuit of greater success. And so we're thrilled to have here with us today is Kenneth Berger. He's an executive coach and holds a treasure trove of tech and industry experiences from his pivotal early days at Slack to his venture backed by top investors and so forth. So Kenneth, his journey through the highs and lows of his technology career has equipped him with unique strategies to prevent burnout and foster a balanced, impactful life for startup leaders. In his upcoming book, Ask for What You Want, it's not just advice, it's a testament to living a life with intention and impact. And I'm very excited for this release when Kenneth gets this book out the door. So would love to read that. But we're going to learn a little bit about that today. So join us as Kenneth shares how to boldly ask for what you want and make your leadership dreams become reality. So Kenneth, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. That's a heck of an intro. I love it.
So Kenneth, tell us a little bit about your journey. I mean, I would love just to know, how you got into the tech world. I know you're currently in San Francisco, the global tech hub as it's known. And then also, how did you get through your early days at Slack and then come to helping leaders as you do today?
Well, I was always a big old tech geek, even back in high school, right? I was, wanting to go into those, halcyon halls. And I remember when I first moved to San Francisco, I was at a, backyard barbecue, having beers with some of these people whose books had been on my shelf in college. And yeah, it was a special time. I felt like, all right, like I'm part of the crew. And so I think I felt that same attraction to the startup world. I spent, 8, 9 years at Adobe. It's sort of a big tech company, did some work I was really proud of there, but I also worked on a bunch of acquisitions. So I got to know these startup leaders, right? These CEOs, these founders, these execs. And that was sort of a whole other thing to me in terms of being able to really move quickly and kind of really dream up a new vision, right? Not just do something incremental, but do something really, really big. Um, and so that was how I ended up becoming a founder. Had an interesting rocky journey with my co-founder, which I can go into, when it comes up. And then same with Slack, right? That these startup journeys were both, I think, so wonderful and interesting and fulfilling, right? To be on the rocket ship of Slack, in the first year after launch. And they were the most stressful experiences of my life, right? They were really hard and they really pushed me to learn and grow in various ways. And that's kind of what brought me into coaching, was thinking about, okay, I could go be a VP product, right? Somewhere, right? I had those opportunities. But there are a lot of people that are good product people, right? And when I thought about what impact I wanted to make for the next stage of my career, it was really about helping people make these jobs sustainable, right? So it's not something where you spend a year or two doing it and you burn out, but something where you can do it for 10 or 20 years if you want to.
I spent a good 15 years in the Bay Area working at large and small companies alike, some startups and some large Fortune 50s. And so I understand that the stress level and constantly being on top of your game, understanding what's going on in the marketplace. So tell us, Kenneth, I mean, in your journey through that period of your time in the Bay Area and in the technology industry, how have you witnessed things change over the past 10 years? I mean, what have been the trends with leadership and style?
Hmm. It's a good question. Yeah, I mean, I think for me, one of the things I've noticed, I touched on it, we were chatting a little bit before, was just how I think COVID and sort of being in lockdown for however many months we were, right, opened up a little bit of a conversation about, you know, I think some people would say mental health, but I'd say even more broadly than that, just feelings in the workplace, right? Because I think for a lot of us, right, talking about feelings in the workplace was, maybe if you're in HR, you had more skills to do that. But otherwise, right, like we didn't really talk about it. It was kind of unprofessional. And I think, being locked in our house with our spouse and our dog and our kids made it kind of obvious, like, yeah, feelings are happening, right? And what do we do with those, right? And I think, rather than it being something that's unprofessional, for me with my clients, like we think about it as data, right? It's not like, oh, if I'm scared or if I'm sad or if I'm stressed, that I automatically need to act on it. But let's consider that data in the same way that we might consider any other data related to our job or sort of how we, what we're doing day to day. And so to me, that's been a really powerful shift of being something kind of below the surface to being something that we can kind of talk about and is a normal thing in the course of work.
One of the things that we witnessed during after the pandemic, where everybody was forced to be at home, well, of course, everybody got used to that remote environment and so forth, and that gave them that sense of freedom of having a control over a place to where they could do their best work. And then now we're seeing that some companies are continuing to embrace that remote environment to allow people that flexibility, and others are pulling them back into the office. And so, I mean, when we're talking about asking for what you want, what are you seeing in this trend?
Oh, in terms of like work from home versus back to office?
Yes, and in the Bay Area specifically, with some of your clients, what are your leaders' sentiment across this? Are they seeing that practices of remote work, was it helpful? Was it a hindrance to the organization? What is driving some of their decisions?
Honestly, I'm seeing really different opinions across the board. I think to me, it's one of these things that's still getting sorted out. And it's something that where there doesn't need to be one standard necessarily, right? I work with some more biotech companies where they're making sort of physical biological things. And so it's really hard to do that, right, over Zoom. And so for them, maybe there's some stronger polls to sort of to be more in person or at least have sort of some rules around sort of when we're in person or which roles are in person. Um, and then we have some companies that have leaned even harder into 100% remote, like no particular hours, like everything's asynchronous. Um, and so to me, what I see happening is less that we're coming to one sort of consensus and more that companies are feeling more free to find the compromise that feels right for them because there's trade-offs, right? It's not like there's one right answer here, but they get to choose something that's right for them and sort of see how it goes.
So let's just dive into this a little bit more. You were mentioning the asking process and understanding those. I guess you have those basically three main steps in the asking process. So let's dive into that and learn a little bit more. First of all, what was the driving force? I mean, you chose this for your book specifically, the asking process. I mean, it's something that I mean, all of us can leverage in our lives, not just at work. But what was the decision to go on that topic specifically?
It's just something that I found myself coming back to so many times, both with clients and in my own life, right? So often, when someone's having a conflict, I'm working with them, right? We go back to, well, have you talked to the person directly? Right. And it's such a classic sort of managerial question, right? Have you talked to the person directly? And so often the answer is no. Right. And so part of, to me, what's interesting about getting good at asking for what you want is understanding all the reasons that we don't, right? That we resist sort of just being very direct and being clear about what we want and accepting the response, which I think is where a lot of people get tripped up, right? Because they're so worried about, oh, if I'm going to get up the courage to ask, then I better get a yes, or coming with a lot of entitlement saying like, I deserve a yes. If they don't give me a yes, I'm going to make them to give me a yes. Right. And either way, we're not really listening to the feedback from the world. And so one of the first things that I always introduce clients to when we're talking about this topic is that mostly we get no's. Right. And I think that's something that I think hits a lot of people hard because
Mhm.
it does feel vulnerable often to ask for what you want, right? Or we come with entitlement to say, I deserve this thing. And so when we normalize, oh, mostly the world tells us no, right? Maybe not an explicit no, but yeah, we'll see about that, or maybe next quarter, or I'll try. There are all these ways in which we get something short of a yes. And
Yeah.
so rather than viewing all those varieties of no's as failure, right, really we're looking to sort of reframe that as that's data, that's information, right? We say, of course I'm getting a no, right? Everybody gets no the first time. So what are we going to learn from that, right? And how do we go back and ask again and ask again?
So Kenneth, I think that brings us back to what we were talking about in the pre-show a little bit. You talked about, people are, they're really good. That's one of our skill sets as human beings is the ability to complain. We seem to complain a lot, and so and your process as far as somebody coming to you and saying, well, and your response saying, well, did you ask them? Sometimes I feel like people are they're afraid of getting that no. And so first thing that they want to do is they want to go to somebody that they trust, that they have the psychological safety with, and just lay it out. It's like, and then just to maybe test the idea and understand. It's like, well, are they going to understand my approach? Are they going to, it's a way of vetting the ask before you actually do it. So what do you think about that?
I think that's a great example of how we can iterate on asking, right? Because maybe we find that, gosh, like when I go up to the CEO's office and think about knocking on the door or sort of requesting the meeting, I get too scared, right? I freeze up, like I'm not ready to ask to be the person that I want to be to sort of deliver, the argument or the request in the way that I want to. And so, instead of saying, oh, that's a failure, that's on me, again, we can take that as data. Like I got to know for myself before I even open my mouth, right? Like my body was telling me I'm not ready to do this. And so that's what we can do is sort of really accept that and be like, oh, not fight against it and say, oh, that's terrible, like I should be brave, I should be ready to do this, telling us all these stories about how we're supposed to be, but to really accept how the world is and say, I'm too scared to do this, right? So I'm going to go talk to someone easier, right? I'm going to talk to my partner or my buddy at work, um, and roll it out there. And maybe that starts to get me in a place where I can make the kind of request I eventually want to make to the real decision maker.
Right. Well,
So,
I'd love to hear from our team here as
yeah,
far as go ahead, Howard.
so is what you're doing is helping people reframe, like, expect the no, but that doesn't mean you shut down, and then you now need to sort of rethink or pivot and reframe your question or your ask. Is that the process?
Yeah, so Sam alluded to the kind of three main steps. So let me briefly describe those. So when I talk to people about asking for what you want, the first step is articulating what you want, because I think a lot of people again come into it with complaining, right, where there's just saying, oh, like it's so annoying that so and so is doing X, and so they're articulating it as a problem or as someone else behaving in an incorrect way versus as a desire of like, oh, I want the world to be a different way, right? And we don't have any, the world doesn't owe us anything. And so, really articulating is, oh, the world doesn't owe me anything, but like, I want something, right? And so I've got a humble request, right? Of, man, I really wish, this thing were true. So I think that can be a really important step to sort of let go of that entitlement that I think, some people will come in with. I think of, people pleasers and control freaks as two very common sort of archetypes in this world, right? And so the control freaks are saying, I deserve this, right? And the people pleasers are saying, oh, I'm so scared to do this because what if they don't like it, right? If they say no, or what if, they're bothered by my request. And so for both of them, articulating exactly what they want and sort of owning that is really important. So then the second step is about just saying it out loud, right? And sort of there's, we just spoke to one example of that of, well, maybe I'm not ready to make the big ask to the big person, right? And so maybe there's iterating on who I ask or how I show up when I ask or exactly the words that I use or how I frame it. And so there's a lot of sort of nuance in actually finding the courage to sort of say what you want and stand proudly for what your desire is. And in finding the right context to give you more success, right? Because again, you're probably going to get a no the first 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 times. And then the third step is accepting the response. Because again, I think often people come in with that expectation that they're going to get a yes the first time. And usually they don't. And so accepting the response means not taking that as a failure or as evidence that you should go back and crawl in a hole, but that to say, oh, how do I learn from that, right? What's the data here? And so what do I do next? So not taking it as sort of this, emotional, like very, problematic thing, but as a normal part of the process, right? Of course, right? We're learning about what's going to work well next time.
It's funny, it just triggered a kind of a thought about, dealing with children and you tell them no, but that doesn't stop them. They keep coming.
Right, exactly. They haven't been trained out of it.
So it brings me back to a time where in my career where I had to do a big ask in my career. And so I would love to hear from the team here as far as your experiences of going to your boss and asking for something big and how you prepared for that. But in my story, what it was is it was 10 years ago, or over 10 years ago now, before remote work was a thing. And so I had at the time, I had to relocate. My family needed to relocate for, personal reasons. And so they were going to the Midwest where I'm at now. And I was working at a large Fortune 50 company. And like I said, work wasn't a thing yet, but I was going into the office every day and catching the train at 5:30 to get in and into the heart of San Francisco. And then the first thing I would do when I'd get in my office is pick up the phone and call some international location, whether it was Australia or Hong Kong or wherever it was in the appropriate time zone. And I just followed the time zone through the different areas. But I spent my whole day on the phone, on the computer, and with basically remote meetings. And so I went up to my boss at the time and say, hey, I need to relocate, and so and I'm willing and I would love to continue working for the company, but there's no locations around this area, and I would be working remote. But it's like, and I went through the whole situation. I come to work and I'm on the phone all day. I don't see what the difference is. And that was I secured that and it was able successfully and was doing that for a good 4 years. But so it was a great win for me, but it was tough. I was so nervous going into that conversation, because of course I've worked my whole career achieving that level of responsibility, and I was afraid of losing it. And it was a huge step. So definitely I would have appreciated having your book at Kenneth during that time for sure.
Well, bravo for standing for what you wanted, right? I think to me that balance you're describing is really the key to it, right? That you don't want to come in too entitled or overconfident, but you also don't want to come in too much of a wilting violet, right? It's a sort of balance of that humility and that confidence, that to be confident enough to stand for what you want and say, yeah, this is what I need for my family, and to be humble enough to know that, like, yeah, you don't owe me this, right? Like, I'm just asking, and I hope that you'll say yes, but I know you don't have to. Because I think ironically, when we own that humility and the fact that we can't control other people, I think that often opens them up more to being influenced, right? Because they know they're still in control. It's still up to them how to decide.
Good points. So I'd love to hear from you, Shar. Have you had to go and have a big ask?
Many times. You know, I want to bring up something here as the token female on this call. Particularly as a young executive, it was very intimidating to walk into the boardroom for the first time. As Kenneth, you can understand, as an executive coach. And, you know, particularly, not to hit a sore spot here, but in a male dominated room, and be the 27-year-old female sitting there, and, you know, recent college graduate and new to being in the executive boardroom, and having the courage and to articulate things in a male dominated room, right? And to realize that women communicate a bit differently on general and scientifically. We do. Men like to put together engines and work and build stuff and get things done. And I'm just overgeneralizing here. And women like to talk in flowers, and we like to talk all over the place, and we have very intriguing different mindset. And sometimes we can go all over the place when we're talking about the same thing. So I actually had to do a lot of research in how to communicate in that type of environment, and be able to realize that my authenticity and my positive mindset and my creativity can be a real asset to this meeting. Because believe it or not, in the healthcare world, which is where I did a lot of my executive work, you know, 80% of our population is female, but in the executive room is predominantly male. So I did bring up, how do we improve our communication to really appeal to our audience, which is our employee, to have that authenticity, creativity mindset, and to be able to communicate and articulate without sitting around talking about how we're going to reconstruct an engine. And oftentimes I was reacted to in very adversely, just because of my more out of the box ideas. So my ask would be, back to the point, is how do we think differently? And I don't feel like I'm being like one of my executives had a bazooka, imaginary bazooka gun. You know what I'm saying? I used to imagine him on my CEO and president would sit on the other side. And as soon as I'd open my mouth and go, well, let's talk about employee engagement and let's talk about the culture, and all of a sudden he'd pull up his imaginary bazooka gun, boom. No, Shar, we got to increase productivity. We got to get to the return on investment. We got to get the financials straight. What are you talking about, the people aspect? And I'm like, but the point is, it's the people that drive the productivity and the art margins and the asset. I mean, and I didn't want to come across as just another dude in an argument with my bazooka gun guy. And by the way, he did have animals in offices where he shot tigers, lions, and bears. I'm on his wall. Like, he had dead animals on his wall. So I was like, that's pretty intimidating. But my point is that I'd go in and try to influence change and give him a different perspective. And at one point I had to walk into his office and say, do you know why you hired Shar Miller? And he goes, well, yeah, because you're an HR manager or whatever. I said, you know what? It's because I am a woman and I do have a different opinion and I do have a different mindset and I am a people advocate and a people person. So please, when I'm in the boardroom, Mr. President or operations president, please do not imaginarily blow my ideas out of the water. I mean, it's not inspiring me to be brutally honest and give you the authentic transparency that you need to improve our employee engagement, authenticity, etc. Ultimately, I had to leave that position because I felt like I could not break that barrier. I could not break that mindset in that particular area. Later in my career, I learned how to, I have a degree in communication and organizational management, and I really try to figure out how to crack that nut of why can't I seem to blend into that environment. Now, decades later, things have changed from a diversity and inclusion perspective. But I guess, Kenneth, my question for you is and it doesn't have to just be a woman, but people of diversity and that have not normally been at the table, I would say, without generalizing the world. How do people do that so that we can have the psychological safety to be honest, to be transparent and forthright with our ideas? Because this is why we are hired in the first place, right? So, Kenneth, what's your recommendation so that people feel more comfortable doing that at the risk of maybe losing their job?
It's a beautiful story, Shar. Thank you for sharing that. You're giving me goosebumps. Yeah, I mean, the good and the bad goosebumps. Like, that sounds like a crazy environment, bazookas included. So, I'd say, when I'm working with, with women and people of color, I think often one of the most important things I can do, especially because of my identity, right? Because I'm an old white man, with a white beard, is, I can't claim to know their experience, right? It's like I'm not, someone who's going to sort of experience bias in the same way. But what I can do is I can acknowledge the reality of the bias they face, right? Because I see it too, right? I mean, I see it with my clients. I saw it in my work, when I was an operator myself. Um, and so to me, it really comes back to the acceptance, right? That, to say, yeah, like I am experiencing racism and sexism, or my client is experiencing racism and sexism, and to really own that, like, yeah, that's real. And so if I'm frustrated, if I'm scared, like, of course that's justified, right? Of course I'm going to be feeling things about how, fundamentally unfair and unjust it is. And those feelings are not going to magically solve sexism and racism, right? But that's not something we can solve overnight. And so it's a balance of owning that it's real and that all the feelings related to that, are absolutely justified. And okay, so what are we going to do about it, right? Coming back to a kind of more pragmatic perspective, because we can't, magically wish it away. We can only move forward and act with the reality that we live with. And I think, to me, the thing that I found that's sort of most helpful in helping people take these brave and scary and uncomfortable steps is actually letting go of success as a metric. Because I think that's one of the ironic things about asking for what you want is I think some people say, "Oh, Kenneth, so you figured out the process to know for sure that you're going to get what you want." No, of course not, right? Sometimes the world tells you no, and no is the final answer. And so I think part of what I hear in your story is that, yes, there's an asking for what you want there, but part of asking for what you want is just being real about who you are, right? It's connected to identity. And so I heard you saying, this is who I am, like take it or leave it, right? I know I'm valuable. I know I bring a valuable perspective. And so to me, that's an end in itself to be able to live your life, both at work and outside of work, being really true to who you are and being proud of who you are and not trying to hide it. And so the beautiful thing about that is that even if the world tells you no, right? Even if you don't get what you want, there's a reward just in getting to be yourself, right? And knowing that you have value. Because yeah, maybe this isn't the right place for you and you need to leave the company and go somewhere else, right? Maybe we need to wait for the world to come around to, this bias is not okay.
Well, may I follow up with one comment? Because I know I'd
Yeah,
like to hear what
please.
Sumit has to say. You know, I ultimately had to leave that organization, but I also think many, let's say more junior executives that are learning this competency around having the communication skills and having the courage per se, oftentimes have to look at their interview process at the very beginning of getting that job offer. Because I think a lot of times we're so excited, oh my gosh, I'm making six figures and I got all these great benefits and I get promoted and I get to move to San Diego and San Francisco and all these things. And I have this tremendous job. And all of a sudden you're sitting there. I was in Tacoma, Washington, by the way, when that happened to me. But to go, oh my gosh, I moved all the way over here for this big job opportunity and I can't truly be myself. I have to be the stereotypical executive presence with the professional hairdo and sit in the boardroom like a cutout and be able to articulate myself without really being who I am, right? And sadly, I think a lot of people will leave a position within a year or two because culturally it wasn't a good fit for themselves. So it's true that when you're going through an interview process, you really have to look at the culture of the company and also see if you are a good fit to spare you and your family, like what Sam was saying, relocating all over the place and trying to be successful. You really have to ask yourself, so is this person, my president, my superior, my supervisor, is their personality type really going to be a good fit for me? And I think today more people are realizing really do your due diligence in analyzing the culture and looking at various resources like Glassdoor and really deciding is this or other resources, but deciding can I thrive in this environment? Can I truly make a difference? Because sadly, when you pick up and relocate and you're sitting there by yourself, it sometimes is a little too late. So thank you, Kenneth. And I appreciate that you are bringing an awareness because I feel that some executives have a blind spot to this particular topic and are afraid to talk about it because really you wonder why your company's not successful. something like this has a lot to do with it. Thank you, Kenneth. I'm curious what Sumit has to say, because I know he has a perspective of this matter.
Oh, yes, sure. So I think asking is very different in my part of the world. And typically you tend to think of a leader as kind of almost like a father figure. And I use the term because most leaders in this part of the world are men. Um, and so leaders wouldn't take it positively if you were to ask or to be seen as challenging of authority. And people would also shy away from asking direct questions to leaders or to be seen as challenging authority. And similar to the story you were mentioning, I've got one where I was newly hired as an HR manager in a large organization, and I was supporting the consulting workforce. So consultants, they had HR consulting as a vertical as well. So the view they came with was that we know it all, and what are these people in HR going to teach us about HR? Um, so I proposed doing an engagement survey because we had lots of motivation issues, employee turnover was high, and so on and so forth. Um, and one of the key results that came across was that close to 34% of our people were not engaged at work. And that was the first highlight I called out in my presentation. My boss saw it and she lost it. And she was like, why are we saying this? Shouldn't we say that 2/3 of our people are engaged instead of saying more than 1/3 are not engaged? I said, no, I want to show them the mirror. I want the leaders to see that they're doing something wrong. No, but they're very stern people and they're very no nonsense. They will not like the message that we're going with. And we got into an argument where my view was that I don't really care if they don't like it. My job is not to tell them stuff that they like. My job is to tell them stuff that will help them change. And this is exactly why HR doesn't have a seat at the table. HR actually gets the seats for others to sit at the table. So massive debate, and finally I told her that fine, let me present. I'll deal with the consequences in case they don't like it. And the first thing the India CEO said was that I've never really seen HR come to me with such a courageous presentation and stating the facts as they are. And I would like you to go all over the country, do some road shows, tell all my leaders this is exactly what they're doing. So initially, although it was difficult for my boss to deal with her authority being challenged, she did have the grace to come back and say that you're right, I was wrong, and next time we'll do it your way. But I think it was one of the fortunate ones where there were no negative consequences for me as an individual. Otherwise, you get into an argument with the boss and things don't really go too well for you in your next review.
Yep. No, it's a great story. And to me, it brings up like some of the, to me, the classic challenges of sort of like, management across cultures, right? Because I've worked with people who've moved from China and India to the US, working for US companies, having to figure out sort of how to navigate those cultures, and the opposite of people in the US working for companies out of Asia with management teams with very different expectations about communication and influence. And I think that question you're getting at, I think often comes up of, ooh, how much do I bring me and say, oh, they hired me because I'm different, like because I bring this different culture? And how much do I say, you know what, like if I want my point to land with this person, maybe I do need to adapt to their preferred mode of communication. And I think that's a really hard one because it is something that is very personal, right? How much can you change and say, oh, this is just me adapting to the environment? And how much is over the line where you say, you know what, this isn't me, right? This is not how I communicate. I don't care if they don't like it. I'm going to say it the way I want to. But I think it's a very individual question, but I think it's an important one, especially in a cross-cultural kind of communication context.
So the other thing, Kenneth, I mean, one of the pieces that you mentioned as far as your process, you know, first articulate what you want, say it out loud, and then accept the response and learn from it. Part of that middle part there is saying it out loud. So what I'm hearing from you there is that this is where we're kind of either role playing or practicing the ask. Is that about right?
For me, this is, you know, I call this step just asking for what you want. So I think, you know, ideally, right, you're asking the actual sort of decision maker who can make your ask happen. But I think often what the iteration looks like is various, you know, things along the lines of dry runs, right? Maybe there's a safer context. Maybe they tell me, no, I'm not interested, and so I need to come back with a different way of framing it. Or maybe I need to reformulate my ask to say, oh, I thought this was what I wanted, but like now that I've gone through this a few times, I'm not actually sure that's what I want anymore. Maybe my ask is actually changing, like, and what my actual desire is changing. So it can really encompass all of that, right? And sort of the point is more to say that none of this stuff works unless you say it out loud, right? If you just, you know, wish and wish and wish and grumble to yourself, right, you're just going to get frustrated, right? You're not going to make the change in the world, because asking for what you want is about influencing other people in the end.
So
So-
go ahead, Howard.
What would be your advice be, let's say, to someone who's done this multiple times and it keeps getting the no response? You know, what's the next step at that point? What's the guidance?
Well, I mean, it really comes down to the individual circumstance, right? Because I think, you know, essentially it comes down to the three steps again, right? Of, you know, am I, you know, is there a way I want to iterate on, you know, what it is that I want, right? So maybe, you know, through this process of asking, what I want is changing, right? Or I think, oh, maybe I'm more likely to get a yes if I change my ask. And so I'm okay with that ask being something slightly different. Or maybe it's more in the way that I'm asking it. I need to ask in a different way or to a different person. Or maybe I just really need to stick with acceptance of, man, I've tried this 20 different ways and the answer has still been no. And maybe I just need to, you know, go home and accept the no, because guess what? We don't get everything we want in life. But to me, you know, what I was getting at with Shar was that even if you get a no, right? Even if that boss is not the right boss for you and they're never going to say no, there is something so fulfilling in itself in just standing for what you want and saying, I'm not going to hide, I'm going to say it out loud. And so that way, in a way, you win even if you get a no, right? Because you had the courage to ask for what you want.
Well, I agree. I want to mention one thing. I think it really comes down to your core values, and really understanding who you are. So I always have my own personal core values, which is compassion, dignity, and respect. I've always, I don't know, I may have heard that early in my career, and then I caught it as my personal core, even when I changed my careers, as well as started as an entrepreneur, owning my own business. And then also talking to my employees that we always must have compassion, dignity, and respect always in every communication, not only with our clients, but with each other. That includes that we hold our executives accountable to communicate with compassion, dignity, and respect, and our leaders to do the same. And it is a performance problem if we cannot communicate with compassion, dignity, and respect. The challenge is that's a subjective thing to say, these are our values. And when our behavior does not exemplify our values, then how do you make it from subjective to something concrete, like specific behaviors? So what I would say to my leaders is almost like, if you take, back in the day, we used to have video cameras like this, right? If we have a video camera and we're physically watching our leaders communicating to an employee, and we have grumpy looking faces and we're looking at our phones the whole time and we're not paying attention to what we're saying, and we come back with our bazooka gun or whatever it is, what does that tangibly look like? And then how do we hold ourselves hold ourselves accountable to make a change? And as an expert people facilitator and talent management strategist, that was a difficult challenge and a road to do, is go back to the leader and say, why are we not living our values in the way you communicate with our employees? So it's just a point I want to bring up. Kenneth, what's your thought about having your core values and living to that, even at the sacrifice of potentially your career, if you're not able to withstand that in the organization?
So to me, this actually relates very much to the conversation about diversity inclusion as well. Because to me, often, when I'm working with founders and CEOs around, issues of culture or values, we're really looking at what are the things that we expect of every employee, right? And so maybe we're saying, all right, we want, everyone to sort of have, integrity and respect and sort of these things that we expect. Yeah, everyone is going to operate this way. And where do we not specify? Oh, where we have space for people to be different, right? That some people are going to be louder and more extroverted, and some people are going to be quieter and more introverted. And we're okay with both of those, right? Like, it's okay for you to be different. It's okay for you to come from a Western, more direct culture, and it's okay for you to come from an Eastern, more indirect culture, right? And so I think that's a really interesting conversation for a lot of teams, because they haven't always thought about it in that way of, oh, where do I actually leave white space to say it's okay to be different ways here? And where do I say, no, it's not okay to be this way, right? Like, you're being straight up rude. You're not being direct, and rudeness is not okay in our culture.
So I really appreciate you sharing us your perspectives here, Kenneth, and really looking forward to that book coming out. Can you kind of summarize for our listeners the core aspects that you want them to hear from our conversation today?
Sure. So I'd say the first thing to remember about asking for what you want is the world mostly tells you no, and that's okay, right? It's not a failure. That's the beginning of a learning process. And so to follow that learning process, you have to articulate what you want, right? So really know what it is, what's that desired state. You need to ask for it, right? So stand proudly for what you desire, right? And be proud of who you are and what you want. And to accept the response, right? That, again, mostly we're going to get no. And that's how we learn, right? To really accept that we got to know, what is the no telling us? Where do we go next, right? Like, what's our next move in terms of trying to make the influence that we want in the world?
Thank you so much. So, Kenneth, I mean, it's been wonderful speaking with you today. I mean, and like I said, I'm looking forward to that book coming out. For our listeners that want to learn more and about this process, maybe get some of your executive coaching, what are the best channels for them to contact you?
Check out my website. It's kberger.com, Kberger. So you can learn more about me and my coaching, and there's a contact form to reach out there.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for tuning in today's People Strategy Forum, and we look forward to next week when we'll join you again. All right. Take care, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you,
Thank
Kenneth.
you. Bye.
Bye.